Well, welcome everybody. It is January 7th. It is 2025. And so welcome to our first of many for the year of our hot topics. And this one being the Tuesday deep dive. We're starting the year out actually special because our guest speaker today became available. And I'm like, well, if I can get him on this day, we'll start a week early. So that's what we're doing. And we're going to start out with two deep dives. Today, we have Mr. Brian Westrin. We're blessed to have you, sir. Brian is the Michigan Realtors Legal Counsel. I think I'm giving that to you correctly.
Sure.
And what we've talked about is really bringing kind of a wrap up to the settlement. And I just asked him to handle or address one other subject matter. And everything working out well. We'll have Q&A time at the end of all of this. But Brian, I turn it over to you. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Darwin. Obviously, a lot of last year was spent unpacking the settlement and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And then obviously dealing with a myriad issues that have been reported in the news that are at times maybe askew from factual. The nice thing as we enter 2025 is we did get a head start August 17th with the practice changes, trying to sort of wrap our arms around it and what it does mean, how we communicate it to the client, and certainly how we train within the brokerage. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about today is sort of a back to basics, where we're at on basic agency law, especially as it pertains to the settlement and those formalities that you need to adhere to. The good news is as a designated agency firm, you've already got a head start. You've already got a head start on some of those conversations about written agreements and formalities that need to be observed. So I don't want to belabor too many of those aspects, but at the same time, one of the key points that I think I'll continue to harp on during the 45 to 50 minutes of time we're together is really this is an opportunity, I think, for brokerages and agents to take a new tack at empowering their clients. And an empowered client, I think, in my estimation, and certainly I think with the litigation that we just saw, and certainly there's litigation that continues to crop up, is the best kind of client because it puts you in the position to have a client that is aware, that understands the nature of the transaction, not necessarily to the level of sophistication that you as a licensee and a professional would, but certainly a way to emphasize to your client your value, but also their role in the process. So I'll probably be sounding that phrase quite a bit throughout this presentation, but I also want to make sure we have ample time for questions because I think that's one of the most important facets of where we're at right now. Obviously, we've got a lot of talking points and we've got a lot of jargon about what the settlement says and what the settlement requires, but what you're all seeing out there in the field and the resistance or hesitation or confusion you're seeing with clients and even colleagues is important for all of us to understand and to sort of dig into. So first and foremost, I thought it would be beneficial for us to talk about the fact that now we're starting from a new point when it comes to buyer brokerage compensation. We no longer look at buyer broker compensation through the lens of a unilateral offer of cooperating compensation through the MLS. It is now very specifically negotiated between the buyer, client, and the buyer brokerage. And quite frankly, that's why this first bullet point I think is so important, because really, if we can retrain our brain a bit, that in this post-settlement world, it is the buyer who negotiates and agrees to pay the buyer broker commission. That is a really important phrase because that phrase speaks to the value of services that buyer is willing to pay, and also the value of services that buyer brokerage is willing to provide at that specific price point. And that's important for a couple of reasons. The biggest one to me is that a piece of the settlement says that you cannot receive more than what is in your buyer brokerage contract. So that tells us all that if you're entitled or you're seeing opportunities to make more outside of what you've negotiated with your buyer, that is not going to mesh well with this new world, which says the buyer brokerage commission is negotiated between buyer and buyer brokerage. And if you find out down the road that there's more on the table, that's going to require some, I think, inner workings between client and brokerage to understand whether it makes sense to amend the contract upward or downward, whether the case warrants it. But we'll talk a bit about that too as we get into Q&A as well. But the key that we jump off from is that buyer and the buyer brokerage have negotiated what the value of services are and that they want to engage in this relationship. And then obviously we get to this first use of the phrase, empowering that buyer client to understand the different ways to alleviate what they've agreed to in their brokerage contract. So in the new world, the buyer can look to either the listing broker or the seller to assume all or a portion of that obligation. Now, you may already know, based on your experience in the field, there are brokerages that have elected to move away from asking their seller to authorize cooperating compensation. They've simply said, put your brokerage needs or your buyer's needs in the purchase agreement, and my seller will review the offers and make a determination on how that all plays. That is in some ways a frustration, I think, for a buyer brokerage and a buyer client to sort of understand the lay of the land, but it's nothing that you can't overcome with sort of the proper dialogue with the buyer. I think the buyer who understands when these eventualities pop up, oh, well, this seller in this subject property that you're not interested in or now interested in has indicated that they are not offering cooperating compensation. So this is the tack that we have to take in order to alleviate this financial obligation that you've entered into with the buyer brokerage. Those are just examples of scenarios where you do have this opportunity to educate your buyer, and not only on your value and what you do for them in terms of the negotiation and the pursuit of that subject property, but also your willingness to be creative in trying to alleviate a financial obligation that they've indicated that they don't have the wherewithal or are not going to want to bring that cash to close. All well knowing that they are bringing the financial burden to the transaction to close in the first place. So, but note that these are two alternative compensation structures, and you kind of have to know how both of them fit together as you're talking to your client, but also as you're trying to navigate the back and forth with the listing firm that you're negotiating with. Now, first out of the gate, when we know that the listing firm is offering compensation, that the seller has authorized that listing brokerage to compensate, that payment arrangement can be accomplished between the two brokerage firms. And that's going to be a little bit of a sea change for folks because we've been so accustomed to utilizing the MLS for that purpose, right? We've always had this sort of ingrained knowledge that under procuring cause rules and under participation rules within the MLS, anybody who is a participant in the MLS could claim that they are the procuring cause for a particular transaction. But now it's going to really come down to whether there has been an agreement established between the two brokerage firms. And why is that important? Well, in Michigan, we don't have the same level of signature requirement as we do with our clients when it comes to brokerage. It's a really good idea to have that in place, though, because there is no requirement to have a writing for a brokerage to brokerage promise to pay. That means that oral promises or even casual promises could be construed as potentially enforceable. So when we've talked about broker to broker agreements, and I know you've kind of been introduced to the concept, and my understanding is you're willing to enter into those when you find a buyer who's interested in a property that there is cooperating compensation, and vice versa. The key for all of this is making sure that if you are listing a property and the seller is offering cooperating compensation, that you're communicating that offer of cooperating compensation on the one hand, but also how you earn it. Because the most dangerous scenario here is that you have listing firms and agents that are out there sort of casually articulating what is available on a particular subject property. And that creates a possibility where you've got buyer brokers out there who are going to claim that, no, I worked with this buyer. And even though this buyer ended up moving on with another buyer brokerage and signing an agreement, I'm the procuring cause of this transaction because I saw the property with them. Now, things have changed in that regard, right? We don't have the same analysis for procuring cause as we did prior to the settlement. Moving off the MLS changes a lot of that procuring cause analysis. We still have the duty to arbitrate. We still have those baseline principles that are protected within the realtor world. But what is more important to me now is that if you are a listing firm and you are offering cooperating compensation and you are a buyer brokerage who is bringing the buyer, that you formalize that in an agreement in some form or other. We have published a buyer broker or broker to broker agreement form that lays out the traditional understanding of how you earn that offer of cooperating compensation. Essentially that you have the buyer under contract and that you've taken the buyer through to a successful closing. And to us, those are really important criteria to lay out, because if you don't lay those things out, you're almost inviting potential disputes. And even if those disputes are wrong-headed or they ultimately are losers, it's still a time suck. So when we talk about things like, well, is the listing broker offering cooperating compensation? That's important from the buyer's perspective, but it's also important from the listing firm's perspective of how that's articulated. So when we talk about it going forward, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that in Michigan, you have requirements in order to collect payment from your clients. That's the statute of frauds, says that you must have a written agreement in place in order to enforce payment. But that same standard is not in place for allegations between brokerage firms. So the only way to really protect against potential disputes and the time suck therein is to formalize it in an agreement, and also make sure that when you're offering cooperating compensation, that you do so with not only what is being offered, but how it is earned. The agreement, though, isn't really such that you would include it in the purchase agreement, because neither broker is party to the agreement. But I will say that there is room to reference the broker to broker agreement in the purchase agreement. And quite frankly, this is another empowerment piece here, right? You're making the buyer and the seller aware that these financial obligations have been contemplated, and whether or not it's the broker to broker agreement attached as a contingency in the purchase agreement, or simply a checkbox that designates exactly how it's handled within the purchase agreement. Those are sound policies to make sure everybody is aware where the money is coming from and who's responsible for it. And while the brokers are not a party to the purchase agreement, it is also very important for the parties to the purchase agreement to understand exactly how these obligations are being handled. So any questions real quick before we move on to the next concept? Because this is sort of this amorphous concept of, now we don't have the MLS where everybody sees the offer of cooperating compensation. We use the MLS in different purpose now. It's obviously a huge advertising platform, but when it comes to offers of cooperating compensation, we're already seeing instances where they've authorized it, but they're not advertising it. And that creates a little bit of a sea change for all of us. But at the same time, nothing we can't overcome.
No, Brian, actually, it's great with what you just covered, because it flows right along with what our company does have in place on the purchase agreement. One point of clarification, because I think it's going to be fairly new for most of the people that are on today, is the aspect that we don't, if the compensation is coming from the listing broker, and this is an important part, that we don't necessarily have to have the compensation agreement but I know in talking with you that potentially we could create an agreement without having a written agreement. How do we avoid having that situation? And I'm guessing it's when, if I were to call you as a buyer's agent, to call you the seller's agent, and I said, hey, are you offering compensation? And if so, how much? Is there a particular way that our agent should be answering that question?
Well, I think it's going to come down to what the seller's authorized and, quite frankly, what the brokerage policy is, because some brokerages have adopted the policy that, yes, we are offering compensation and the seller has authorized it, but the seller would rather not reveal the amount because they want to see what the offer entails. And that gets back to a little bit of I think a negotiation strategy as well, because the seller and the listing firm are in a position to see a myriad of different offers, some of which are going to ask for two, some of them with two chickens, one chicken, three chicken, whatever. And to the extent that the seller is informed of that latitude, that is a value is in and of itself, right? Because they have a separate listing agreement with that listing firm that obligates them to pay the listing firm and obviously authorizes up to a specific amount for cooperating compensation. So when, to get to your point, Darwin, when we think about how you answer that question, a lot of it's going to come down to what you've agreed to with your seller on how you're going to communicate it. You may also say to the seller that we believe that this policy of advertising the specific amount with the way in which you earn it is the best and most sound policy, because that way we don't have to worry about how many different iterations of the offer of cooperating compensation are out there, which I do think invites potential disputes. But if you're on the other side of that and you're calling somebody and you're asking whether or not an offer of compensation is available, and they say simply yes, and quite frankly, we're not revealing what the amount is per my seller's instructions. At that point in time, I think from the buyer's side, you have to assume that it's not really offered and that you can either ask for it in the purchase agreement or you can attach the broker-to-broker agreement as a contingency to the purchase agreement.
Very good. So if we were to say, well, my instructor or my seller has advised us that they will offer 3% at the asking price, would that be a pretty safe response?
Yeah, I think you could articulate the up to a specific amount, and you also probably want to lay out, as you can see, I don't know how well this looks on your end, but the language that we've incorporated here is that that the buyer broker represents the buyer through a successful closing, that the fully signed agreement is delivered prior to or with the buyer's offer to purchase. Those are all elements and aspects that protect the listing firm, and I think also enhance the buyer's position that this is the buyer who's won, and also the buyer brokerage who got him there. So I think incorporating the criteria on how it's earned is a good belt and suspenders approach as well when you're articulating that the seller has authorized cooperating compensation up to this amount.
Sounds good.
And just to give you an example, obviously the use of the purchase agreement and sort of the checkbox is perfectly fine. A compensation agreement between brokers, though, is helpful for the listing firm, but also the buyer brokerage firm, where a buyer brokerage firm, may have full transparency on what is being offered in cooperating compensation. Therefore, they can submit this agreement to the listing firm to say, okay, I've got this buyer who's interested in your property. This is the agreement that they would like executed as part of the offer to alleviate their financial obligation. At that point in time, I think it's usually a simultaneous situation, but at the same time, we go back to this idea that your seller and your buyer are much more aware of how this push and pull works. If it's simply, yes, seller's open to it, authorizing cooperating compensation, but there's no specific amount. At that point in time, the buyer is educated that here are the different strategies that we can employ. We can use the purchase agreement, and we can also use the idea of a compensation agreement and attach it as a contingency.
And just to answer or to make sure everybody understands, you only need the compensation agreement when we're asking the listing broker to be responsible for the payment.
Absolutely.
And it's a very clear statement. So we don't want to get the compensation agreement and have the seller paying it as part of the purchase agreement.
Correct.
That
And
is,
that's a very embarrassing moment in time.
yes, it is. And thankfully nobody's gotten trouble on it yet, but it's happening in the real estate world.
It
And
absolutely
the
is
compensation
happening.
agreement, by the way, for everybody, it should be in your documents. Whatever we're using for signing, for preparing forms, it should be in there. And I'll let the new to our group, the new to the professionals family, I'll be getting out there. We're still working on forms. Lansing, I know you guys are a little bit different, but we're working to be able to make sure we take care of all of you and that all of you know how to move forward with this. And I think, Brian,
I have a
that-
question. Please say
okay.
more about that, about the embarrassing moment that you just mentioned earlier.
You want to
Absolutely.
take that one?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's the use of concessions, and this is actually a good segue because oftentimes when there is no offer of cooperating compensation that's published in the MLS, it's now going to be direct communication from the brokerage, the listing firm, and if for instance, the listing firm has received authorization from the seller to offer cooperating compensation, and they've communicated that, but then the buyer submits its offer and asks for a broad request for concessions, but doesn't articulate what it's for. The example we'll see in the Q&A later is, say, $7,500 in concessions from the seller. If the seller agrees to that, but also has agreed to cooperating compensation, they're paying double and they're conceding double. And that's happened in a couple of instances in the Downriver area and in West Michigan, where the listing firm had to really kind of acknowledge egg on the face and work through that process with their seller. Usually it's going to end up in a cost eating by the listing firm.
And Brian, if I add to that, it actually goes outside of the concession. We've had purchase agreements accepted with the seller paying 3 chickens and the listing broker having agreed to pay 3 chickens.
Exactly.
So you guys do the math and again, thankfully so far within our company, all parties have understood what was the intent, but we've committed to a listing broker to pay 3% and a seller to pay 3% on top of it.
Yep.
So that's where the error comes in. Just be wary of that. And I see Karen, you got your hand up. Is it your question regarding this subject?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So with the purchase agreement that we currently are using, there is 2 check boxes, and one stating that not requesting seller compensation, and the other one states that it is. Well, I've learned in the process of all of this that is only if the seller is paying directly, because there are some brokerages that are not doing broker to broker, very few, but there are some. So we actually on the purchase agreement check the box that says seller's not paying, but then we have the broker compensation agreement included in the offer, because we can't write anything on the purchase agreement, but we send that with the offer and we put down whatever the seller was willing to pay, which is, if it's the, like you said, the 3 chickens. So we check that and we send it so that that listing agent is signing that to agree that yes, we do now have a broker to broker agreement for this 3% to be paid by the listing agent, by the listing brokerage to to the buyer agent brokerage. So that's how our documents have been currently. Is it going to remain that way?
I mean, I think that from our perspective, at least as contracts go, if you're not asking the seller directly in the purchase agreement, then it may make good sense on the buyer's side to include a broker to broker agreement as a contingency to that offer. That buyer's offer is contingent on the execution of this broker to broker agreement. That way, it is the buyer's wish to make sure that that financial obligation is addressed before they proceed with the transaction. And I
So
don't
we
know,
can
Karen-
write that, we can write that into the offer. That
That
contingent.
the offer is contingent upon the execution of a broker compensation agreement?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
because
you
it's
could-
the buyer making their offer subject to these 2 outside parties doing that.
Yep.
Karen, by the way, which office are you in?
I'm in the Lansing West office, Delta.
Okay,
Mhm.
all right. It just helps me out with a few priorities that'll be coming up.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
Yeah, and that
absolutely.
works. You can either identify it in the written form, or you can obviously attach it as a contingency.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Mhm.
much.
All right, so did Barbara still have a question, or is that a hand from?
I do have a question.
Hey.
So I had a situation where the agent wrote in asking the seller to pay a 3% commission and then also sent along a broker compensation. Is it acceptable in the counteroffer? What we did is we just clarified that those were a total of 3% and not like a double dip. In the purchase agreement, is it acceptable to address it there? Because I had originally said we wouldn't sign the broker compensation with it being in the contract, but she was adamant that both had to be signed for her broker.
So, but in the purchase agreement, are they asking the seller?
Yes, they were asking the seller to pay it, and then they
Yeah.
sent me the compensation and wanted both signed. So in a counteroffer, we just
Yeah, I
talked
think,
about both and said it would be a total of 3% compensation to the broker and not both.
I mean, I certainly think if you're receiving an offer that is asking for both, that's an opportunity for you to show value to your seller, to say, we've identified this as a potential trap, and financial snafu that could really come back to haunt us. At the same time, you could also contact the buyer brokerage and say, I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish here, but because my seller is offering cooperating compensation, or it's authorized, you can take it out of the purchase agreement or make it contingent on a broker to broker agreement, because my seller has no interest in paying as three chickens out of their own pocket after they've already agreed to this cooperating compensation that comes out of the listing agreement. And that's where I don't know that buyer brokerages and buyers are appreciating the push and pull of the contract that you have with your seller. Because depending on how it's worded, like Michigan Realtors listing agreement says that you seller are authorized, this is the amount that you agree to pay listing firm, and you authorize X amount to be pulled from that global amount. Some have separated it out and made it 2 separate fees, but I think in your circumstance, it's probably one of those scenarios where communications at such a premium to say, my seller is interested in your buyer's offer, but they need to be clear that your buyer is asking for the cooperating compensation that's been offered and not a separate direct payment or, concession, as it were, from the seller.
I had that conversation with the agent and the broker and got nowheres with it. So that's why I put it into the purchase agreement, just saying that it would be a total of 3%. And it was one and the same thing. That was the understanding from them. They just,
Yeah, and I think the only downside to that, Barbara, is that if if there was a dispute with the seller and or if the title company or the closing entity was in any way confused about it, that could lead to some hiccups. But our preference obviously is to make it very clear where for not only the parties, but also the closing entity, where the disbursements are due, and quite frankly, that they reflect the intent of the parties.
Thank you.
Sure. And then obviously the other side of the coin on when you know that the listing broker's offering cooperating compensation has been authorized is the situation where the listing broker has indicated that they're not offering compensation, or they're not offering enough, or they're not telling you the amount. So in those circumstances, there's a couple of different angles here. And we've kind of already established that your purchase agreement has a payment provision to cover the buyer brokerage commission amount. You're asking the seller directly. And then obviously the use of a concessions form is a little bit trickier, because to avoid the circumstance that we kind of discussed earlier, where you had, essentially an uncharacterized global amount requested in concessions, and then also cooperating compensation were one and the same, but they were double. This would allow for you to say, okay, well, instead of making a request for concessions through the purchase agreement, we're either going to use the click that says this is the amount we're asking the seller to accommodate, or we're going to ask for a broader scope of concessions and say, okay, and then you have to itemize it. If you don't itemize it, that's when it gets really hairy. So you're asking for $15,000 in concessions, and then itemize how that's applied to the costs that the buyer needs to get to the finish line. But just by way of example, we always, this highlighted piece here is the illustration of what we've been talking about. If the listing broker has agreed to pay the buyer's broker commission amount, the listing broker should not have their seller client agree to pay the same amount. That's just sort of a clean statement that articulates it. But when you look at the two addendums, and these are sort of, I suppose, broader examples of what you've incorporated, at least this next piece, into your own purchase agreement, where you're saying that the buyer is asking for the buyer broker's compensation to be handled in the purchase agreement. The reason we make them distinct as addendums is we do like the fact that it triggers a conversation, right? You're having a unique conversation with the client about what the next step is. And if we learned anything from the litigation, it's that, this allegation that these people take the stand and they say, oh, I had no idea. I had no idea I had the opportunity to negotiate or do all these things. This suggests that there is that moment in time, which I do think in a purchase agreement is exactly the same thing. You're saying, hey, this is the strategy we can utilize. How do you want to submit this purchase offer? And the buyer's aware. And of course, then on the listing side, the seller is going to be made aware, because the listing firm is going to talk them through what the offer says. It's important, though, I think, to distinguish between this idea that if we're asking for broader concessions, which often happens, we're not just using that as a way to always address brokerage compensation, because quite frankly, concessions historically has been, oh, we did the inspections and we found that there's marginal damage to the roof, or some of the windows have issues. Those types of things typically get addressed in the concessions. You can certainly itemize a brokerage ask in there, but at the same time, if all you're asking for is buyer broker compensation directly from the seller, just ask for it in those terms.
And Brian, I'll jump in to give clarification. So on our purchase agreement, it is formatted the way it is very specifically so that it cannot be missed. So it is the first paragraph on page 2 that addresses buyer broker compensation. The next paragraph is a separate one dealing with concessions that does specify that it is for closing costs, taxes, prepaids, and any other allowable expense. And of course, you would specify, as Brian mentioned, if there is anything else more direct to that. So again, for our Lansing area new to us, we're working and going to be bringing everything to you and clarifying, hopefully within the next couple of weeks here.
All right. I want to do a few, just to knock out a couple questions here that I think are illustrate some of the concepts we talked about, just to make sure that they're clear. This question here, buyer agency agreement requires the buyer to pay the buyer broker $10,000. And remember, that's the starting point, right? The buyer and their buyer broker have negotiated this. This is the value of services that both are willing to agree to. And the listing broker has made it clear that they are authorized to offer 10,000 as a cooperating split. We can't use that terminology anymore, but I still think it's relevant here. Should the buyer broker include language in the purchase agreement as well, requiring the seller to pay? So as Darwin and I have been talking about, when you know that it is an authorized offer of cooperating compensation, you do not then ask the seller as well. So the buyer broker should ask that the commission that would be offered in cooperating fashion be confirmed in some sort of a compensation agreement between the brokerages. But you don't want to put your seller in a position to accept that additional language, because that will be a very embarrassing moment. All right. Another scenario, say, oops, sorry, got ahead of myself. The seller signs the buyer, the seller signs the buyer's broker compensation addendum or agrees to pay for the commission in the purchase agreement. Do we also need the compensation agreement between the brokers? No, this is that scenario where the seller has agreed in the purchase agreement to compensate the buyer's broker, either directly or through that concession, if it's a broader ask. Then that listing brokerage should not also be asked to pay the buyer's broker. Now, what happens sometimes, though, and this is important to distinguish, if you're dealing with a firm that's not offering cooperating compensation, or they're saying, my seller's authorized it, but we're not revealing, we want to see what the offers are. If the practice, and this is sort of the downside of this on the listing side, if the buyer's making an offer and they're asking the seller to handle their financial obligation directly, that will probably send the listing firm and the seller into a new negotiation to say, okay, well, if we entertain this offer on the back end, we have to work out something relative to our listing agreement, because right now we've agreed that this is my fee and that from this fee, we'll offer this in cooperating compensation. So it may require a specific one-time credit back to the seller for the purposes of that commission agreement that they've made with the listing firm, or it may be something where they renegotiate it altogether. But just be aware that when you have listing firms that have said, okay, well, we will offer it, but we're not communicating it, that sometimes will be the consequence of it, where they get an offer that's asking for a specific amount, and it could very well be handled in a broker-to-broker agreement, but it's not how it's presented. All right, let's stop there for a second. And are there any questions? Christina, did you have a question still outstanding? I think you're muted. Sorry.
Unmute.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so in the GLAR purchase agreement, paragraph 6 specifically addresses the compensation when the seller has not agreed to pay compensation through the listing company. So if the seller has agreed to pay that compensation and there is a separate compensation agreement, is paragraph 6 left completely blank because there's already a separate compensation agreement?
Yeah, my understanding, I've reviewed that form, and it's a fine form. I just think you want to make sure that you're making, if it's going to be handled as a broker to broker agreement, or it's going to be handled not as a direct payment from the seller, that the field that talks about that is at least addressed. I mean, you certainly don't want to be ambiguous about it, whether it's zeroed out or whatever it may be. The other flip side of that is you want to make sure that if the listing firm has made it clear that the specific amount is being offered, that you could also attach that broker to broker agreement to the purchase agreement. Of course, you could also, utilize your own firm's forms too. So that's the flip side of it. If you like the way the firm's purchase agreement articulates it, that may be the way to go. But in terms of the forms that Glar has presented, they are well done. I think it's just everybody trying to navigate the likelihood that there will be more direct asks of the seller. And time will tell whether or not listing firms start to go in the direction of just asking for that for the purposes of clarity. So hopefully that answers the question, but I would just make sure that whatever form you're utilizing, if there is a section that calls for the seller to directly compensate or directly alleviate, that it is either clearly articulated that buyer brokers' obligations are met through this broker to broker agreement or cooperating compensation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the agreement in this scenario, this is interesting because this is an important mental gymnastics moment for all of us.
Brian, can I have you? Karen also had her hand up here.
Oh, sure,
Karen, before we jump.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you so much. Basically, what Christina was just mentioning on that number 6, it does, the seller agrees to pay, blah, blah, blah. However, when we're doing the buyer broker agreement, the other here is no buyer broker compensation requested. So this has been the confusing factor because we have to, when we're working with the buyer broker compensation agreement, then we're told to check no on no buyer broker compensation requested and then have the buyer broker agreement signed. And when I check that, a lot of times with some realtors, they will see that and say, oh, you're not asking for any compensation, even though the buyer seller is going to pay 3%. I said, no. And then I'll say, look in the offer, you will see the buyer broker compensation agreement. But now, because we were told we could not add that in the purchase agreement, but now we can state, I'm just reiterating, now we can state contingent to the contingent to the buyer broker agreement being signed.
Yeah, you can certainly always create a contingency for the purchase offer.
Okay.
Obviously, making sure that the forms you're using or the way that you're articulating your offer is clean is the key.
Yes.
I mean, like I said, Greater Lansing has a nice suite of forms. If there are certain wrinkles that maybe seem unfamiliar, I would certainly raise those concerns with the team over there and say, well, if I want to accomplish this, how do you suggest? Or obviously, you may well end up using different forms, right? You may end up using a brokerage purchase agreement that accomplishes it in a way that you like. So.
And what I would add to it, Brian, from company perspective, Karen, is to continue moving forward as your broker managers have instructed, and know that I am working with them. I'll be coming out to your offices and we're going to be talking about all the paperwork and answering all the kind of questions that we're actually having here. And we're fortunate to have Brian with us on today. So
Yeah,
we'll be out there to be able to work with you and talk with you on all this stuff.
Okay, yes.
I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I was just going to say it would be really nice, and I know this is our GAR form, but it would be really nice how we have these 2 checkboxes. If there was just a box in there that also stated that what we're going to write in, just to state that there is a buyer contingent to buyer broker agreement, and that we can check that, and that will simplify it.
Yeah, I'll let you know that we are working in what we believe is going to simplify many of your agreements as we continue to move forward and assimilate ourselves together. But that's great. Thank you for that input.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. It's all yours,
Yeah.
Brian.
Yeah, and then I think, this is probably the last question that I think is really important, is understanding what happens with shortfalls, right? You've got a scenario where an agreement requires the buyer to pay buyer's broker 15 and the listing broker has offered 10 in cooperating split. Well, what happens with that $5,000 shortfall? Because we go back to the original premise, which is buyer and buyer brokerage have agreed to the value of services. But here, you've got a scenario where the cooperating compensation offered is less than what you've agreed between your buyer and buyer brokerage. And so if nothing else is done, that listing broker will be on the hook to pay the buyer broker $10,000, obviously, as been articulated in the cooperating compensation agreement. But then that additional $5,000 still falls on the buyer. So at that point, the buyer broker is in a position to say, okay, well, I've got to, obviously I've empowered my buyer by really educating them on how this push and pull works, right? We may have a scenario where vast majority of your financial obligation in the buyer brokerage contracts addressed through cooperating compensation, but then we can also ask for any remaining shortfall directly from the seller. Or, there's also the do you want to be the hero of the story scenario, which would be a brokerage policy. Depending on what the amount is, you could theoretically amend down or forgive that amount. But that all depends on where the brokerage is on that policy. Just be aware that if you have a scenario where your buyer brokerage contract is greater than what is being offered in cooperating compensation, that puts you in another position to either negotiate the rest of that on behalf of your buyer in the purchase agreement, or figure out what your brokerage policy is on addressing that between client and brokerage. Darwin, is there anything that unique that have you run into that yet? Sorry.
Yeah, and actually there was a question there, and guys, I can never speak 100% on that part of the company, but if you sign an agreement that says you got 3 pigs as compensation, get your 3 pigs. And that's what Brian started with, is that we as a company signed a contract with a buyer, and we've gone through and illustrated all of why we earned the 3 pigs. And they understand that any compensation that we get from the listing broker, the seller gets credited toward that. They still owe us 3 pigs. Now, if I only get 2 pigs from the seller and a half a pig from the listing broker, they still owe us a half a pig. Okay? So don't think that we're trying to protect the buyer from paying us what they've signed a contract for.
Right.
Get what you signed a contract for. That, I mean, I want to be, you can tell I'm a little bit passionate, guys, because that was the change. We don't have to accept what a listing broker is compensating anymore. We've got a contract with the buyer, and that's what the buyer is responsible for, seeing that we get paid. Now, in the end, if it is less than what you've agreed to, you talk with your managing broker, and together you make a decision as to how you move forward with that buyer. But there's the short story that can go into a lot more conversation, but we don't have time for that today.
Yeah, and that's really well said, because I think that one of the narratives that we're all going to be pushing for in 2025 and beyond is buyer brokerage is extremely valuable. And that is one of the things that has been left sort of out there in the undefined territory in the media. And it's really important for when you talk to your buyers to say that, this is a negotiation. This is our fee. This is what we will do pursuant to that fee. But we don't work for free, obviously. And you can't tell your client that anyway. But more importantly is the buyers need to have their mind shift to understand that there is a value to the service. If they decide to go it alone, we're already seeing those scenarios where buyers try to sort of speed date and get what they can in a customer service relationship. I say that is a perilous journey, because at the end of the day, for a realtor who is open to this concept of customer service as basically their business model, it really does dilute the value of agency. I mean, in a negotiation, especially in a competitive market, having a buyer advocate who is a realtor out there who you've got a contractual obligation with, that's so much more significant than, hey, can you help me? And I'll work as a written agreement for customer service only, because what's to stop that buyer from going directly to the listing firm or the seller? And those are the scenarios that I think give me a lot of pause, but I do think that it's important for buyer brokerages to be able to educate the buyer on the value of advocacy. And as Darwin says, you don't want to be in a position where they come to your consult under the impression that what you do has no value, that you just open doors. And that's clearly not the case. In fact, the sweat equity that goes into buyer brokerage is significant. So we've got about 10 minutes or so. Darwin, you think it makes sense to just kind of go Q&A, or do you want me to touch on sub-agency a bit? You're muted, but I don't know.
Yeah, it helps. It helps if you're unmuted. Well, let's see what because I'm going to be making rounds. I've done rounds with our existing groups. I'll be doing that with those that just joined us. I'll be getting out to the office. We'll be talking all of that. Let's shoot for Q&A and see what we've got with the final 10 minutes. And if anybody has that, they can bring that one up. But I know the one Q&A, it's a bit off topic, but I think an important one. Can you take the TPCA and just give a quick response on that?
Yeah, I honestly don't think it's going to change significantly. I think what they're trying to grapple with right now is the introduction of AI and the use of some of the robocalling that has really proliferated in our lives. We've got some great resources on the TCPA in our legal library, which talks about the basic tenets of what a brokerage and certainly client relationships require in order for you to do direct outreach and have those types of correspondences. But I think what we're going to be talking about, and the reason why I'm punting on a little bit on this, Darwin, is honestly, I don't know where the FTC and all the other acronyms, TCPA, is going to end up after Trump is sworn in, and quite frankly, the departments start to take a look at their interpretations of these rules. We know there are certain changes that are going to be in place relative to new technological advancements, but it's kind of like the other big sea change that we all anticipated with the mutual ownership interest that was supposed to go into effect in the next couple of weeks. That's now been stayed and enjoined from going into effect by a court of appeals down in Texas, and everybody was preparing to comply with that as well. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on TCPA changes, but I would implore you to go to, and I'll send it to you, Darwin, just so you have it in your library. We did a white paper on what the requirements are, and really, I think the big changes are going to be coming down to how does the advent of all of these new AI, add-ons and supplements impact what type of consent, person-to-person consent, you require. So it's a sort of a punt on that question, but I think it's more, I don't want to get you all worried about something that may.
Probably not anything to really worry about. Any changes.
Brenda says.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one, Brenda, that everybody can use some clarification. Brian, this is one that I actually talked with you about, because we are designated agency, and I'm a newer agent, and I'm going to go hold the experienced agent's listing open, What is the best way for us to handle this?
So in a designated agency office, I think there's only really one way to do it. I mean, I think if it's somebody within the firm that is helping, which I hope it is, is a scenario where you've got a designated agency contract with your seller. It makes all the sense in the world to add that additional person to that contract to make sure that they are identified as a designated agent of the seller. There is no real meaningful way for that new that person who's helping you out, whether it's because you're out of town or whether because any number of reasons.
Well, primarily they're doing it to be able to get leads or maybe even hopefully sell that house.
Yeah. I think with designated agency, I mean, the only scenario where you could certainly be representing a buyer and going to that listing, but where you're opening the house on behalf of the seller, you have authorization from the seller. I don't think there's a seller on earth who's going to view that as not an agency relationship, where if you don't have the formality and you don't have the written agreement, you automatically punt into traditional agency territory, which is not where you want to be as a designated agency firm. So I always err on the side of, if you're going to incorporate people who are going to be working on behalf of the seller, they have to have that written agreement or add-on in a designated agency world.
So
the other
just
piece to that puzzle obviously is, what's that?
I was just going to say, so to be really clear with everyone, the appropriate way is, yes, we should designate that agent to now represent the seller also. And that should be done on paper.
Yep. I think that's absolutely the best policy, because you just never
if you're
know.
gonna, excuse me, I'm
Oh,
sorry, I
mhm.
apologize. But if you're gonna do that, then how is that person gonna be compensated if the home is sold?
Well, that's going to be a matter of company policy as well. But what I think is the main takeaway, Sherry, is that you kind of have to be careful that, are you working with on behalf of the seller? And clearly you're authorized in this instance by the listing brokerage to work on behalf of the seller. But if you then are working with a buyer, don't obviously go back to the fact that the settlement requires a written agreement in order to tour a property with a buyer. So the organic nature of procuring buyers in that way just doesn't really work in this new world. It's a tricky thing. Obviously, if you were not holding it open as an open house and you had a buyer and you wanted to become a designated buyer agent for that buyer, that's one of the beauties of designated agency, is you can create that firewall. But here you'd be opening an open house on behalf of the seller and the listing firm.
Right, and so if
So-
you're adding this person on to the contract
Mhm.
and that home gets sold, that person is part of that contract, so how do you do that commission?
So the real easy part is that we sign an agreement for 6 pigs. And we know that the listing side of it is 3 pigs and the buyer side of it is 3 pigs. And both agents are representing the seller. We get 6 pigs and each agent gets 3 pigs.
I know, but what if a buyer comes in and has a separate real estate agent?
Well, then
But yet I'm
that
showing
agent-
it for the seller and I'm
Yeah,
on the
well,
seller's
but
contract.
remember, you're just designated. You're not going to get compensated for holding that listing open. That
So then I
just
guess my question is what is the purpose of putting us on the seller's contract then?
so that you
Compliance.
don't have to try to disclose to, well, here, guys, I'm going to say this. It looks like we opened up a can of worms. So how about this? Next week, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And Brian, thank you. I hate to leave you hanging. If anybody's really got it, you got my phone number. Feel free to call me, but I'll tell you what, we'll do a catch-all that starts with this situation on our Hot Topic Tuesday. That will be, let's see, 7/14/21. the 21st. We'll address this one right up front. And if for some reason I forget, you guys just slap me right upside the head and say, hey, Darwin, you said you'd do this one first. We're going to keep it really simple when it comes to this. And that's really where it sounds like we're complicating something. Listen, I was thrilled when I heard Brian say this for the first time, because it was the only way that my mind could work out how you would properly do this and not screw everything up. So as I've said with everything with the settlement, there's really only two things that have changed. Doing what we just talked about is part of those two things. How do we move forward with those two things that have changed? But we'll hit that. And if it's really, again, if it's really a concern for you that you got to have that, you guys can let me know. So we're now right at 1 o'clock. I'm going to say, Brian, any final words that you got to wrap up with?
I'm going to hit the road up to Mount Pleasant to do a board orientation. But obviously, if you have questions that pop up, Darwin, and you need research done, please reach out and we'll make sure we provide the resources.
Absolutely. I appreciate you. Thanks again for jumping in, making yourself available. And guys, many of you, this is your first one ever. So welcome aboard, and know that there's lots more to come. We're always open for ideas. Please send them my way. There's a reason we call it Hot Topic, and there's not a whole lot of plan in advance, is because we want to address the hot topic for that week. So we'll run from there. Don't forget, this recording will be on the HRC Agent Development channel on YouTube. Brian, thank you again. Travel safe, and we appreciate it. We'll look forward to you sometime in the future.
All right. See
Have a
y'all
great
later.
one.
Happy New Year.